Welcome everybody here. My name is Eddie Maloney. I'm the Executive Director of our Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship, which for those of you who don't know, we call Candles on campus. I will mention Candles. I'm sure some of you know of Candles, and if you hear it, that's us. So I have the distinct and pleasurable task of welcoming everybody here this morning. So on behalf of my colleagues in Candles and the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, welcome to the annual symposium of the Doyle Engaging Difference Program. A little background for those of you who are new to the Doyle program. Since its inception in 2009, the Doyle program has supported faculty and students at Georgetown as they work to address issues of justice and inclusivity in their teaching and scholarship. So at Candles, for us, this work includes the Doyle Faculty Fellowship Program, which offers faculty an opportunity to redesign a course to incorporate the theme of engaging difference. It also includes the Doyle Film and Culture Series, which showcases films, speakers, and performances that connect the issues of equity and justice that are at the core of the Doyle program. And finally, the Doyle Diversity Grants, which are the curriculum enrichment grants supporting class-related activities that engage students with issues of diversity. Our colleagues at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs work to support faculty who teach the Doyle seminars, courses designed to offer students an opportunity to learn and apply methods for researching issues of difference. Furthermore, they oversee the Junior Year Abroad Network, which promotes undergraduate field research on difference and diversity. The Doyle Engaging Difference program, through the work of Candles and the Berkeley Center, hopes to serve not only as a resource, but also as a catalyst, an incubator for innovative approaches to addressing the challenges of teaching and learning in our diverse world. It's our pleasure to be involved in this important conversation today. And as you can imagine, this kind of event cannot happen with a lot of folks. And so I just want to thank the folks on the Candle side. I'm sure Michael will say something about his colleagues as well. A lot of people work really hard to put this event together. Jocelyn Schultz-Lewis, James Olson, but I particularly want to thank Michelle Onona. Michelle, where are you? For all of the work that you've done to put this together today. Absolutely. So thank you. And I'd now like to welcome Michael Kessler, the Managing Director of the Berkeley Center, to introduce the panel.
Well, thank you, Eddie, and thank you for all of you for coming, and thank you to the panelists. And I will follow up Eddie's thanks to his team, to thank his team, Maggie and James and Jocelyn and Michelle, and also to thank members of our team at the Berkeley Center, Melody Fox-Ahmed, Sarah Singha, Carly Henry, our events manager, who helped put all of this together, as well as Claudia Winkler, our communications director with publicity, and Sarah and Melody as the team leaders on this project in collaboration with Candles. Since 2009, this has been a very productive and important collaboration between Candles and the Berkeley Center. And the title of this, Teaching and Learning for Reconciliation, in some ways captures the work that the entire program was intended to do. We live in difficult times, tensions are high, people are upset in multiple directions, the times are perilous, it seems, and as a theological ethicist, it's been that way for a long time, long before the calendar, before this calendar was even created, actually. So it is important to keep that in perspective, but also to recognize that we have distinct and crucial tasks as educators in addressing these substantial challenges. And one of the important things that the Doyle program aims to do is to think in the curriculum, supporting faculty who are trying to teach and conduct research and share that scholarship with students, and to help students equip themselves with the skills of critical thinking and dialogue and communication with others, and learning how to live and talk and interact with other people in more sophisticated and important ways that can build a peaceful and just and reconciled community that of the kind that Georgetown, as a Jesuit Catholic, plural and global and diverse community, aims and strives to be. So with that, I would like to introduce our distinguished colleague, Marjorie Balzer, who is going to help us. Sorry, I'm pulling up her short bio. Marjorie Mendelstam Balzer is a faculty fellow at the Berkeley Center. In fact, I think one of our absolutely original and from the founding fellows who's been with us the entire journey so far of the last 12 years. And is a research professor in the Department of Anthropology at Georgetown University, where she was affiliated with the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. Balzer's research is in social theory, interethnic relations, religion, the dynamics of nationalism, and the anthropology of the Russian Federation. She holds a BA from the University of Pennsylvania and an MA and PhD from Bryn Mawr College. Please join me in welcoming Marjorie Balzer.
Include our panelists at this point. Can we have folks come up in alphabetical order? Let's see, Deidre, Father Lado, Sheryl, Under, perfect. Thanks to the Doyle and Berkeley teams. Welcome to the panel, Teaching and Learning for Reconciliation. My nickname for this talk and for the panel is exploring hot issues in new productive ways, starting by honoring and acknowledging pre-colonial indigenous peoples of this area, the Piscataway and others. This exciting panel covers a range of cases of collective trauma, social pain, and healing that include and go beyond the burgeoning variety of state and UN-sponsored commissions. The word reconciliation is used in many different ways, and in the news this week, it's been used for as diverse places as Kenya and Afghanistan. As scholars and activists at Georgetown, it's hard to be objective these days, in quotes, and it's crucial to be passionate about our work, while at the same time striving for as much detailed data and data analysis as possible. For those who wish to know more about models and past experiences with differentially mandated state or UN-sponsored truth and reconciliation commissions, including Chile, South Africa, Rwanda, former Yugoslavia, Canada, many more, see the excellent US Institute of Peace database. For me, reconciliation, especially religiously motivated, ethically grounded reconciliation, raises issues of what we call action anthropology, or engaged anthropology, and the need to acknowledge where we are coming from in presenting and debating any hard topics concerning justice and competing, overlapping, or intersectional injustices. Clearly, Georgetown specifically has a lot to consider and act upon, given our legacy of selling 272 people in 1838. Our documents, positions, an important apology ritual that occurred about a year ago in April 2017 are on our website with key tag words: liturgy, remembrance, contrition, hope, slavery. On this diverse panel, we aim for understanding generational, plural identity, and gender sensitivities. For context, we should acknowledge Jesuit and other missionary legacies, for better or worse. In framing this discussion, I also want to highlight the painful paradoxes raised in some famous analyses. I'll just name three. Justice, First Casualty of Truth, by Human Rights Watch's Reed Brody. Unspeakable Truths, by Priscilla Hayner, and For Humanity, Judge Richard Goldstone's brilliant memoir. We also need to recognize classic distinctions among transitional, restorative, and retributive justice, while admitting they may have fuzzy boundaries. Now let me turn to introducing our stellar panel. In alphabetical order, Deidre Janice Austin is our star undergraduate in the Walsh School of Foreign Service, class of 2019, majoring in culture and politics with a focus on religion and social justice. She's also pursuing a minor in African American Studies and a certificate in religion, ethics, and world affairs. Her research interests include reconciliation as a means for conflict resolution to global problems, and the role of the Black church in society today. Deidre is involved in several Protestant ministry organizations. At the Berkeley Center, she's one of our student fellows for the Doyle Undergraduate Fellow Program. She's also on the board of the Brave Summit, honoring the eclectic narratives of Black women. The 2018 summit brings together women leaders and participants for a day-long conference that happens to be tomorrow in the McDonough School of Business. Father Ludovic Lado, SJ, is an anthropologist and activist from Cameroon and a visiting associate professor in the School of Foreign Service. His research concerns social justice in Cameroon with regard to the Catholic Church and Cameroon politics, particularly the presidency of Paul Biya. He's been director of the Institute of Human Rights and Dignity, Center of Research and Action for Peace, and is a past research scholar at Washington's Woodrow Wilson Center with the critically important project, The Challenges of Religious Fundamentalism for the Secular State in Sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Sheryl Souza is a Botswana First Nations colleague from Canada and a current Fulbright Fellow and visiting professor at Georgetown in our English department. It's been a pleasure getting to know her, a professor at University of Toronto. She's in their English department and their Center for Indigenous Studies. Note they have one. Her research focuses on Indigenous law and literature, with particular emphasis on writing by Indigenous women. Her acclaimed Indigenous women's writing and the cultural study of law was just nominated, literally this week, for the Canada Book Prize. It is about Indigenous women's writing from Canada and the United States, as it addresses case law concerning tribal membership, intergenerational residential school experience, and land claims. Her current project analyzes Justice Thurgood Marshall's papers in the context of Indian civil rights claims. And appropriately for this panel, she's been involved in an exchange project comparing Canada and South Africa on issues of reparation. Andrew Walker is a program associate in Georgetown's Office of the Vice President for Global Engagement. He's a recent alum holding a 2016 Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown, where he studied international politics and women's and genders issues. He was a 2017 fellow at Georgetown's Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And while there, as a Bank of America fellow for women in the economy, Andrew researched and wrote the report Cooperative Connections, connecting female artisan home-based workers through women's cooperatives in Jakarta, Indonesia. He admires our brand new, shiny gender justice initiative and is a student engagement leader in the hashtag #HeForShe movement at Georgetown, advocating gender equality. He points out they've been given some grief for that name, given its not intended implication of a gender binary. Now let me turn to my first question for the panelists, and I want to make clear that this is the same question for the first round. What does reconciliation mean to you, given what you research and what you do as an activist? So, Deidre?
I'd say my introduction with reconciliation began with a book, Radical Reconciliation, Beyond Christian Quietism and Political Pietism. And it was in that book that I actually started to examine what reconciliation really means. And for the Doyle Program, we actually had to read an article on reconciliation. So I've come to understand reconciliation as being creating a recreating relationship between God and oneself, and then within oneself. So really, it's really important to practice self-care, because if you're not reconciled with yourself, you can't be reconciled with others. And then reconciliation with others. And I looked up the definition of reconciliation. So it basically means the restoration of friendly relationships between two parties. But we have to understand within the context of reconciliation that there isn't always friendly relationships to begin with. So what does it mean? So I guess now I'm working towards understanding what does it mean to have radical reconciliation, to create relationships between people who may be different from us in a situation in which there was tension in the past.
Father Lotto.
Yes, thank you. Well, I must say that growing up, being raised as a Christian, well, reconciliation was, first of all, basically, I understood it more in terms of reconciliation with God, of course, given the place that the sacrament of reconciliation holds in the Catholic Church. And of course, it also involves an interpersonal dimension, also reconciliation with God, reconciliation with one another. And then I went on to join the Society of Jesus, which has, as in its own foundational document, a specific line, and that was in 1550, it was written, that if you decide to join the society, you must be ready to work for the reconciliation of the estranged. So that was right from the 1550. And then, of course, I've been in recent years very much involved in reconciliation as a social kind of mission. Working in a center where you actually try to reconcile communities which were broken or estranged by ethnic conflicts or religious conflicts. So it is very much part of my daily work today, and obviously maybe we will return to this later on. There is always a huge tension between reconciliation and justice, and we have been struggling with that. So I would say, in the same line with Dada, that reconciliation for me basically means repairing and restoring broken human relationships.
Sheryl.
Thank you. I think my comments are in dialogue as well with my colleagues' comments. Reconciliation was brought to the foreground in Canada with the recognition by a former government of the residential schools and their impact on Indigenous communities. And out of that recognition came the desire on the part of the government for Canadian society to engage with a truth that many people knew or had lived and experienced and had personal knowledge of, but that hadn't been acknowledged more widely in society. So reconciliation came to the foreground as a government initiative. And what it did was it brought into public debate the idea that this legacy, a legacy of what was initially called genocide and then was softened into and restated as cultural genocide, came to the foreground. And it had to do with understanding the effects of the residential schools on Indigenous communities. They had, at one time, more than, I can't remember the exact number of schools that were in operation, but they ran for more than 100 years. And more than 150 students passed through their doors. And at different times, Indigenous communities, in speaking to government, had asked for recognition of what those schools had done to individuals, to families, to communities, and the broader impact in terms of Indigenous people's life choices. And what happened was that 11,000 lawsuits were launched in Canada by survivors looking for some recognition, some acknowledgement, some way of gaining attention, because as a minority in Canada, less than 4% of the population is Indigenous. There's no critical mass behind the voices represented by Indigenous peoples. So reconciliation has really become this national paradigm that we are involved in a national dialogue that's been important to us. It does pick up on the idea of estrangement, and it does connect with this idea of different broken relationships in society. Mostly what it's done is to try and address the idea of truth, and truth as has importantly been acknowledged, truth and justice don't always fit together in the way that reconciliation suggests that they do. And so that's been a real struggle for us as we try and come to an understanding of what the right direction, approach, and opportunities might be for reconciling relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples.
Sure. So I think that is so wise, particularly with regard to the action of it. And I think that's something that is really important to me, and the action of reconciliation, and bringing it back to Georgetown's campus, where I was a student, now I'm a staff member and someone who worked on issues of gender and learned about issues of gender here. I think there's so much work to be done and things to be done. And I think as a community, Georgetown really prides itself on its dialogue, but sometimes we stop at dialogue as the action.
Right.
And so I want to challenge that a little bit. I also, want to acknowledge my own privilege as a white man talking about issues of gender and other inequalities on this campus. And I think that there's a really interesting element. We were talking about, the relationship between action, reconciliation, and truth, but I also think forgiveness is a really interesting thing there, where what, privileged people and people who are, complicit in systems of oppression, they ask for forgiveness for that. And that adds so much more work to marginalized communities, where I think something I've been working on interpersonally and, thinking about this in a more structural way, sometimes there doesn't need to be a forgiveness there to achieve reconciliation.
So an added burden. I want to do a second round of more targeted questions here. And to Deirdre Janice Austin, as we focus on questions of reconciliation as it relates to current students on campus, what more can we do to apply missions of reconciliation? Do you want to talk to us a little bit more about the slavery legacy issue, or however you want to take this? I think we need to bring it to our campus.
I think this has been, a conversation since the working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation. And I feel like an apology was the first step, but you have to go beyond an apology. And right now, the work on reconciliation has been between the university and the descendants, although the descendants would state that they initiated the contact with the university. And I'd say, as of now, I know that the descendants have a special admission status, but I think that since the university did benefit financially from the sale of the 272 slaves, that reparations should be a really important aspect of the reconciliation between the descendants as well as with students on campus. And there has also been a lot of discourse around would the descendants want to attend a university where their ancestors were slaves. So what does that look like? And should Georgetown offer them a scholarship to attend wherever they'd like to attend? Also with reconciliation as it relates to slavery and memory on campus, I also think it's important to address the current students on campus, specifically the Black students who have been impacted by the implications of slavery, which are present in society today, in like housing practices, criminal justice, all of that. So what does it look like for Georgetown's Black community on campus to have reconciliation? And I think that looks like reparations as well, ensuring that there are scholarship and grant programs on campus, in addition to the Georgetown Scholarship Program, which I think is great, or expanding the CMEA, the Center for Multicultural Equity and Access, because there's a lot that they do that they don't necessarily receive restitution for. And a lot of them have been given additional jobs that they're not receiving compensation for, ensuring that we have support services on campus. I know of a lot of students, particularly students of color, that have needed to take breaks due to financial reasons or due to mental health reasons. So are we ensuring that students have the financial resources and the mental health resources they need on campus? And I also think it looks like supporting student organizations on campus. So supporting the BSA and ensuring they have funding for the Visions of Excellence Bar, ensuring the Brave Summit, ensuring that the Brave Summit has the finances that they need to continue the summit each and every year, and also supporting spaces on campus that provide safe spaces and healing spaces for students of color. So the Black House, Casa Latina, as well as the Magis Will Houses, the Urban House, and the Queen House, which I'm also a part of. So the Urban House targets specifically Black men on campus, and the Queen House historically has targeted Black women. Next year it will be targeting women of color. So ensuring that we have those spaces on campus, that we are providing the students with the support they need, and also bringing in reparations, because Georgetown did benefit financially. So that's what I think reconciliation on Georgetown's campus should look like.
It's a lot. Father Lado, using your understanding of the concept of reconciliation as practiced by the Society of Jesus, how can we better learn from and possibly critique and adapt the legacies of one of the most path-breaking truth and reconciliation commissions, that of South Africa? Does this resonate with your work on Cameroon? However you want to take this, I'm curious about the longer-term resonance of what the path-breaking South African case means.
Yes. Well, of course, the situation in South Africa was kind of peculiar if you considered that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was led by Bishop Desmond Tutu, I mean, he kind of tried to bring in some African originality to the process, and through the concept, the African concept of Ubuntu,
right,
which emphasizes the community over, I mean, not over the individual, but which emphasizes healing communal relationships, and instead of trying to kind of identify who is wrong, who is right. I mean, the emphasis is on reestablishing broken relationships to keep the community going. And of course, it was a very controversial, I mean, for some, it was not a welcome initiative, because they thought that he was giving a better share to the, maybe you could say, the oppressors, or and less to the victims. But I think at the end of the day, people kind of think that it was the better way to go, because if what was the alternative? Probably more violence and more bloodshed. So yes, from that experience, many other African countries have tried to emulate the example of South Africa. I can think of course, of the post-genocide Rwanda, yes, where they put in place this gachacha system of reconciliation also, which is modeled on the South African example. And many other countries, especially in West Africa, where I've worked for the past 5 years now, in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, even in Togo, in Cote d'Ivoire, all these countries have, I mean, at least in the years 2000s, they went through bloody conflicts, and so they kind of try to emulate it. But again, at the end of the day, people, it's a very these are very controversial policies or choices in terms of how we reconciled people after the aftermath of intense and very dense and serious human rights violations. Is it just enough to bring people together and say, let's talk and then move on? What do you do with issues of justice? What do you do with issues of reparations? And so I mean, these are original solutions in the context of Africa, which can inspire other people, but obviously they also have their limits and challenges in terms of how people actually understand what reconciliation means. Yeah.
So the messiness of amnesties and all of the ramifications of different kinds of justice.
Sure.
Sheryl, I'm particularly fascinated in places like Canada and perhaps comparatively, if you want, South Africa. Where does truth-telling, cathartic public acknowledgement, reconciliation, and action reparation begin and end? And I'm asking this in part because I've been actively trying to start an Indigenous Studies program here at Georgetown, and I recently heard the Mohawk Akwesasne anthropologist Audra Simpson discussing her new project interviewing First Nations participants in the Reconciliation Project in Canada, intended to address residential school atrocities and generational legacies, as we've heard. Some of her interlocutors have opted out, using their own community rituals for healing. So how do we better think about these complexities?
Right. It's a really difficult question, and I would say that we're definitely still struggling with it in Canada. Part of the dilemma we face is that we have tried the reconciliation practices that other countries have followed. So we have, in fact, enacted financial reparation, but that itself had a very contested process affiliated with it, because one had to earn financial reparation by indicating one's level of abuse and victimization. And that included sexual abuse, that included mental and physical abuse, and also included other kinds of intergenerational abuses that followed. There was a grid used in a form, and you literally checked a box and then had that verified. And so the objectification of people's experiences, having waited such a long time to bring those experiences to light and have them understood as the devastating consequences that they were really challenging for people who had been part of the process. The other complication was that many people were left out of the process. They weren't included or recognized by the settlement agreement that was brought into effect between government, churches, and survivors. So we have communities of people now coming forward and saying this agreement didn't speak to our experience, and it didn't speak about the kinds of things that we suffered from, and those voices are still coming to light. So we're still in the process of really understanding what the impact has been of residential schools. One of the most important aspects of the national events was the ceremonial, which they made very central. So every national event began with a ceremonial fire. It included witnesses. It included the burning of a sacred flame. All tissues that were used, all things that would be cast away were put into the fire and burned as a sacred offering of grief and trauma. And then the fire itself was brought to each national event and then to the final event in Ottawa. And an Indigenous representative was the carrier of both the fire and the ashes. The other thing that they did was they recognized what it meant to attend residential school and to be part of a system that really objectified you as a human being. So every national event included songs, plays, stories, often families meeting each other for the first time at these events because they had, in fact, had to leave and go off into other places. They couldn't return to their communities, not having the language, not having the ceremonies, not having the family knowledge that they once had. One of the events that was most moving was the singing of Happy Birthday to survivors, which had to do with the recognition that children were not celebrated at these schools. And the singing of Happy Birthday, the sharing of cupcakes meant that children had, as adults, had a moment of recognition that was really important to them. The impact of that story in the collaboration between the University of Toronto, the Jackman Humanities Institute, and the University of Western Cape in South Africa was one of real surprise and unexpected knowledge and information. The representatives who came from South Africa hadn't expected that our story had been so deeply embedded in historical indifference and historical erasure, and they hadn't known about the impact of the schools. So we went on a tour, we held a workshop at one of the former schools at the Mohawk Institute, and what they showed us were things that the children had hidden in the walls. Sometimes a little plastic object, sometimes a paper wrapper, little things that they wanted to keep hidden so that they could have some sense of themselves. And of course, this was had a devastating impact on all of us to realize the level of suffering that occurred in the school. I think the work of someone like Audra Simpson is really powerful as a voice to kind of open up that sense of having resolved these issues or having come to or arrived at a sense of our understanding of them, or even a sense that what we did achieved our goals. As I mentioned earlier, Indigenous peoples are a very, very small group of people, Canadian citizens, members of Canada. We don't have the momentum, we don't have the kind of political momentum to keep those issues central for other communities, and we don't have the momentum to continue to allow people to understand the impacts that these kinds of legacies have had on Indigenous peoples, both on reserve and within urban centers. So there's, to my mind, one of the goals of reconciliation should be coalitions, reaching out and working with other communities. I'm in great admiration of the report that Deirdre mentioned. I've read it and sent it on to colleagues at the University of Toronto because I think it's a powerful, morally centered, really strong expression of the understanding of yourselves as a Georgetown community and of your goals. And what I loved best in that report was the sense of we have to own this history. And I thought that was a really strong way of making a really complicated event very understandable. And so I think that that's part of the initiative that someone like Audra Simpson is pushing for, and that being in dialogue with other people who have been through these kinds of practices that have so objectified and dehumanized, hearing other stories, participating in events, but also seeking collaborations and coalitions of people working together, because I think racial justice is not self-evident, and the way to achieve it can't be always looking backward. It has to look to a future that we want to build. And so I think that's a really important goal that reconciliation can urge us toward. Even as we understand we may not have the best answers, we should still be brainstorming and trying out different proposals, different ideas, sharing and thinking together about these kinds of events and putting our best minds to these kinds of questions.
Andrew, tell us more about the challenges of localizing a global movement like He for She on Georgetown's campus. How has our university been responding institutionally to issues of inequality and reconciliation with regard to gender? Basically, what I'm asking, I guess, is a kind of report card regarding empowerment beyond top-down commitments and what sometimes seems like rhetoric.
Sure. So just a little bit of background on He for She, for anyone who's not familiar with it. It's a UN women movement for gender equality. It's about engaging men and boys in being advocates for gender equality. Georgetown signed on in 2016 as an impact champion. So President DeGioia is one of 10 presidents of universities around the world to make commitments for Georgetown to advancing gender equality on our campus. The three commitments that he made specifically are to make Georgetown a safer place for all, which we started doing the work of the campus climate survey and examining sexual assault on Georgetown's campus. There is also creating a pipeline for leadership at Georgetown, like for staff and faculty, which the Georgetown Women's Alliance helps advocate for. And then also advancing research on the role of women in peace processes, which most of that work is being done by the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. So while I was at the Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, I started helping on the staff side with He for She, doing some of the student engagement components, and then I got this new job in the Office of the Vice President for Global Engagement, coincidentally continued working on student engagement for He for She. I think one of the really big challenges with the student engagement aspect of this is really just deciding what it is. He for She is a global movement. A lot of countries have signed on to it, and one of the biggest pieces of pushback that we've gotten, and for good reason, is the name He for She itself. is within the gender binary, which of course, we do not ascribe to as a university. We face a lot of pushback from students about that, and again, with good reason. And also, I think what the movement does do well is acknowledge that women, all kinds of women, cis women, trans women, non-binary, people who are ascribed femininity, experience violence at the hands of cisgendered men. And so we're really trying to figure out how to frame this issue in a way that is inclusive, where we also acknowledge that you do need to engage men and boys to be advocates for gender equality. So I think that's been one of the biggest challenges in kind of localizing this. In terms of a report card, the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security does exceptional research, and they continue to do that. The Georgetown Women's Alliance is continuing this work. The president's office just launched the Task Force for Gender Equity, looking at female faculty members and senior administrators. I think that all is still pretty top-down. I think one of the things that we've faced challenges with also is channeling student interest and channeling the fact that there are issues with gender equality on our campus, that we've named some of them, but others we have not. Georgetown doesn't have a maternity leave policy. It's short-term disability. That is a problem I don't know how students, staff, and faculty can come together to be empowered to take on these big structural issues in a way that's not someone up here deciding what they are and then telling us what the university is going to do about it. I think it's an open question.
Well, I could do more questions and follow up from here, but I think we'd love to open it up for some feedback from the audience. Please feel free to ask questions, say who you are as you ask a question, and perhaps explain where you're coming from as well. Anyone want to start? We have an eclectic range of issues here. Yes.
Hi, I'm Samira Daniels. I've been interested in the events of the Berkeley Center, and specifically I'm interested in new designs for learning scholarship, which I think really needs to be expanded. Specifically, I think the thing that has bothered me throughout the last 15 years is the extent to which, and this is also being brought to the fore in terms of measurement and the quality of insights and so forth. And I just wondered why it is, how do you deal with the issue of those issues that are not, that are unpopular to be voiced or shown in the mainstream media? And I speak specifically about Afghanistan, for example, where there's just a horrendous exodus of refugees, and the news appears to be that the Taliban are approaching and this, but there's a very complex. So I guess how do you deal communicate the complexity of all of these projects? Because what I think is happening is that it's getting less explanatory. We're getting less in our efforts to generalize more and not give pick out that sort of nuanced explanation that can really throw light on something. So I know it's a complicated question.
Is there anyone particular you'd like to hear on this?
I think I'd like to hear from you,
So Sheryl Souza and Father Lutko and Andrew Walker. Right. Got it. Why don't we start with you, Andrew?
Sure. It is a very complicated question. I don't I don't really have an answer for you. I will say, just to respond, I work in communications. That is my job in the Office of the Vice President for Global Engagement. So I've been doing a lot of, and even my work at the Institute, where I was doing research, a lot of that was taking all of like this nuanced research that we're doing really interesting and making it palatable for other people. And that process does get rid of a lot of that nuance, and it's very challenging. I think something also that I have faced in my own personal life is just the fact that I didn't realize the extent to which I've surrounded myself with people who agree with me, and so a lot of times I don't have to explain myself because they get it, you know what I mean? And so sometimes I find myself in situations where, you know, I'm not in maybe like an actively feminist work environment, which I have been in for the duration of my professional career, and I think that is where I have found challenges in explaining the nuances. It's not in, you know, the communications aspect of it. I don't know how to solve that part, but I think really challenging ourselves to not be in our own echo chamber, which again, like I did not realize the extent to which I've done that in my own life.
I was really taken with your question because it touches a nerve for a debate that's happening in Canada right now around the missing and murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry, which has to do with the thousands of Indigenous women who have gone missing and the indifference of government to the calls for some action by Indigenous communities. What's happening around that inquiry and what's happened in the press has been a kind of violation or indignity to the victim, so that details of this person's life come to light, and always the details are the most damning. They speak of different kinds of abuse, substance abuse, alcohol abuse, drug abuse. They speak of high-risk behaviors. They speak about the ways in which this person wasn't a member of society. These kinds of negative characteristics are highlighted in the media, and what they do is, of course, they re-victimize someone who is already been victimized, but they also victimize the family. And so what we're challenged by are processes of adjudication and of information collection that actually make public things that are really, really difficult. One story of a court case where a part of a woman's body was used as evidence was really damning and really difficult to hear, because it seemed so unnecessary and so it seemed to take liberties with an Indigenous woman's body and to treat an Indigenous woman's body differently from how another body might be treated. And there seemed no rationale, there seemed to be no logic, there seemed to be no understanding for the pain of having a body part used in this way as evidence. And so as Indigenous women, I think we're really struggling to find a forum to express the indignities already experienced and the collective sense of those indignities, not just for women, but for children, for members of family, for kin relationships, for other people. When you suffer in silence, knowing about the loss of another Indigenous woman, the loss of an Indigenous student that devastated us in 2014, these are moments that are moments of silencing and of grief that we often feel that we have to experience in isolation, because there isn't a sense of camaraderie or collaboration or collective outrage by other people in society. But then I think the bigger question is really about how permissive we are around Indigenous information and Indigenous knowledge. And why isn't there a call for dignity for Indigenous peoples? Why isn't there a call for dignity for victims? That is to say, can't there be some kind of a body that oversees or looks at this kind of problem? I'm sure many of us know about the calls by the church in Mexico for dignity for the person crossing over that boundary between Mexico and the United States. And the question behind that call is water, is the right to water as a source of life, is that a human right, and should that be defended? And it seems to me that the dignity for the victim is also a human right that should be defended, and something that we agree on, that as a society we think is valuable and important, because those kinds of mistreatments have such painful consequences for family, but then they have legacies that bring up those other moments of violation. So the suffering and the healing can't occur unless we come to an agreement about how we're going to understand or represent victims and also maintain their dignity.
Did you want to take a shot at the nuances issue and coverage?
Yes. Well, from an African perspective, I can relate to what you are kind of bringing into the conversation, because indeed the question is often which tragedies gets much attention and
Right.
which ones are not really highlighted, and why. And one specific case in Africa today is the one in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where for the last decades, I think almost like 3 million people have died, and it doesn't really get much coverage. And this is a place where business is going on as usual, because this is a place of rich in mineral resources, and especially this particular mineral they use in cell phones, and it is very, very, the demand for it is very, very high in international business. So, but no, almost nobody's talking about it. I mean, we struggle with this thing of the articulation between the global and the local, because many of these issues are global, but they are expressed, they have local expressions of
Right.
there are always local expressions of global issues. And of course, the media, the politics of media coverage is, another issue. Yes, there are some of the tragedies which are not covered at all, and it is simply part of the. I mean, some people have argued that Africa should have its own media to kind of bring out some of these unheard voices, but it requires a lot of political will and even, yes, it and of course the issue of the articulation of human rights and business interest. That's something.
tactful.
Yeah, we are really struggling with it at the local level, because in many parts of Africa, conflicts are good for business. Conflicts are good for business. So.
Kind of going off of that, I'd agree with what everyone says. And I'd say, I guess you have to get to the point where we know that the media won't cover all of the stories. So it comes to the point where we have to take our own initiative and we have to research those stories. And I found that there's a lot going on. So for me, I can't take on every cause that's going on. So I have to decide what I'm passionate about and decide what I'm going to be committed to. And then commit to ensuring that I find out those stories and that I do what I can to inform others about those stories.
Beautiful. Yes.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Luke Brown. I'm a current graduate student, recent undergrad, and current employee of the Berkeley Center. My question, I was struck by, Deirdre, you mentioned how for you reconciliation originally is reconciliation between oneself and God, and then Father Ludo's expression of the sacrament of reconciliation as kind of a central node of reconciliation. And so my question for the panel, and perhaps the two of you would be most interested in this, is what is the usefulness of approaching racial or gendered reconciliation through a religious context. What are some of the affordances and constraints of using a faith-based approach to reconciliation?
That's a deep question. I feel like, for me, reconciliation has been viewed through a religious context because it's how I've grown up. And also dealing with tensions within my own religion. So I grew up Protestant. I'm currently non-denominational Protestant. And I'm doing my thesis on the role of the Black church in society today. And with the election of the current president, there's been a lot of discourse regarding, well, the majority of white evangelicals voted for President Trump. So what does that mean for us as Black Christians, as Black people of faith? How do we reconcile our relationship with God and our religion with aspects with other people within the religion that may seem to support aspects that go against our own identity? So I guess that's how, for me, racial justice and religion and reconciliation are all intertwined. So that's where my faith base. And I feel like starting within the faith, because there's so much within like the scriptures and within the messages of Jesus that goes for being people for the oppressed, being people of justice, having mercy, loving humbly, love, all of this religious rhetoric regarding justice. What does that look like in action? And how do we put that in action? So having the religious foundation where there's already so much discourse regarding justice and building off of that.
Of recent, I've been, of course, very interested in the challenges of religious fundamentalism for peace building in the context of Africa. And when you look at the literature around this issue, it basically underlines the ambivalence of religion, that religion can be used to divide. And we have when you look at the history of humanity, actually the issue of secularism, or the idea of the secular state, is very much predicated on the experience of bloody conflicts, of religious bloody conflicts in the history of humanity, and the necessity to separate religion from politics, whatever that means in practice. And also, growing up and working in a much more francophone setting, where you have this strong legacy of church-state division and separations. Yes, the question of how do you handle the religious factor or the faith factor in the context of rebuilding communities or reconciling people. Well, I must say my own resources, both in terms of personal convictions and also belonging to the Society of Jesus. In the early days or centuries of the Society of Jesus, the focus was much more on the promotion, the service of faith. The Society of Jesus used to say, we are founded for the service of the faith. It is there in the foundational documents of the Jesuits. But then, from the 1974 onwards, it kind of redefined that understanding of the service of faith as, entailing the promotion of justice. That was in 1974. And that was in the context of all these dictatorship and injustices around the world, mainly in Latin America and in Africa. And so that's, I mean, and until today, in most Jesuit contexts, you will hear about this faith that does justice, the service of faith and the promotion of justice. It's only of recent that the reconciliation component was added to it. And I remember I attended the last general congregation of the Jesuit, which usually takes place in Rome, where they bring Jesuits from all over the world and redefine or discuss the future of the Society of Jesus. And there was a lot of argument in the room about, indeed, how do you reconcile the two concepts, justice and how do you keep these two together? And some people have been arguing that the Jesuit understanding of justice is the justice of the kingdom, which, of course, brings into the picture the idea that it is not just justice of identifying who is wrong, who is right, and then punishing the guy who is the wronger or the oppressor, or but then it is trying to mend human relationships and keep them going. And that is where, again, that resonates quite well with our African kind of roots in terms of the Ubuntu philosophy, that justice is not just about identifying who is wrong and punishing him or her, but it's also trying to see how you keep the community going when you have done that. So, yes, my understanding of reconciliation goes beyond the judicial kind of, or the legal aspect of it, to include the kind of spiritual dimension of it, which, from my personal perspective, goes deeper in terms of, yes, keeping the community going.
Do the two of you have any other ideas?
I would just say that the churches in Canada are very powerful amongst Indigenous communities, especially in the north. And one of the goals, I think, of the churches should be forgiveness, but not Indigenous peoples forgiving the churches forgiving themselves, arriving at a moment of realization of wrongdoing, hubris, misunderstanding, arrogance, behaviors that have harmed Indigenous peoples, and that the churches themselves have to come to understanding about. And there is that sense that they are engaged in that process through reconciliation. They were, in fact, brought to that process unwillingly. And so there's a sense in which we have to move beyond an even-handed understanding that some of the schools had a good impact, some had a bad impact. We have to understand the legacy as one committed to eradicating indigeneity. Therefore, what that behavior meant for the churches has to be understood on the part of the churches. And Indigenous peoples have to be liberated from that position, the position that's so impossible to hold of being, bestowing forgiveness. It's narrow, it's unfair. There are things about being asked to bestow that I think is another kind of misapprehension of what harm does and about the position that Indigenous peoples hold. And then the other element of it that I think is really important is the ceremonial, and that what can connect between Indigenous and non-Indigenous in terms of reaching common ground and a future is the way in which the ceremonial and the spiritual, the creative life force and the recognition of that on the part of Indigenous peoples can really reshape the messages that the church sends, so that this legacy and understanding of Indigenous peoples as having a worldview and an empathy, a commitment, a sense of stewardship, an understanding of animate and inanimate relationships, and a greater kind of cosmological worldview that includes something like respect for the seasons, recognition of the life represented by polar bears, a love of the natural world, those elements of Indigenous life ways speak to another kind of ceremonial spiritual connection that can be reframed and brought into dialogue with a more Western approach, but that can also give us ways of understanding different paths towards reconciliation that are new paths and new opportunities that can build different kinds of common ground and different kinds of relationships. And so I would suggest that is a way forward through the ceremonial and through what the ceremonial demands of you in terms of it's requiring your presence, it's requiring your intellect, your faith, your soul, your spirit. It requires presence in a way that's really important amongst Indigenous peoples that could be brought into and revive some of the really negative things that have happened because of the ceremonies that have been illuminated by the church, have been appropriated and narrowed by the church in ways that have, again, taken from Indigenous peoples without actually understanding their presence and their humanity.
Sure, I'll just add, I think, there's the Catholic Church and its teachings and how individual people interpret them, and that's one thing, and then there's also, the Catholic Church, the political institution, and both are important, and both have their role in addressing gender inequality on campus, and broadly, I will say they have, affected what we can and cannot do. I think the church, teaches empathy in a way that is really meaningful, and also, I don't know if the Catholic Church is like the beacon of what is gender equality.
Well, I think we have time for one more question. Do I see another hand? Yes.
Thank you. That's great. That's actually exactly what my question is going to ask about, pretty much. So, for reference, my name is Peter Hamilton. I am a sophomore at Georgetown studying government. I am not affiliated with the Berkeley Center or the Doyle Program whatsoever. I'm just an interested student. Just some background. So I am the vice president of the College Republicans, and we recently had an event this week where the College Republicans, College Democrats, and the Black Student Alliance hosted an event about Black history and politics and what we regard as the future, and we discussed reparations near the end of the event. In that level, it seems a lot of what we've talked about today, or a lot of what you've talked about today, and thank you for coming, has been focused on sort of institutional level things that are good and just and we should advocate for, so on. And I don't think there's a lot of disagreement here. So I have two specific questions, focus on personal and then institutional level, specifically for Father Ludo and then Dr. Suzak. So for Father Ludo, beginning at the personal level, we are a Catholic Jesuit university, and there are a lot of Catholic students at Georgetown. For these students who I would, I don't think it would be unreasonable to say are not coming to a lot of events like this or isn't really on their radar, what is the personal responsibility of these Catholic students in regard to the concept of reconciliation, being members of the community in that sense? And then for both Father Ludo and Dr. Suzak, on an institutional level, I'd be interested to hear your international perspective on a domestic issue, which is the concept of slavery in the United States, the impact it plays on our society, and specifically regarding our reconciliation. Now, some people are in favor of reparations, some people believe in reconciliation but don't support reparations. Based on your background and what you've learned about other international cases, what have been some successful ways that have brought communities back together, and what, on an institutional level, could individuals begin advocating for?
Well, I must confess that I've just been here for the past 6 to 7 months, so I can't claim to know, to know the dynamics of the Georgetown institution. But regarding your first question, well, I must say that obviously the Catholic Church is not, and I think you put it very well, is not just, I mean, the Catholic Church has been part of the problem in some of the settings when it comes to you know, destroying people's heritage and actually, and what happened with the indigenous people in Canada also happened in Africa. I mean, evangelization had a violent component to it, which even if you could say it is symbolic violence, but it is still violence when you kind of destroy or try to destroy people's heritage in order to impose another heritage in the name of religion. It is violence anyway. So the Catholic Church has been part of some of these things in the past, and it has been trying to come to terms with some of the, and some of the previous popes have tried to ask for forgiveness, and some people have asked whether that's enough just to ask for forgiveness, because some say it is very easy to say, forgive us for 400 years of that kind of violence, or even slavery or colonization or anything of that kind. But specifically on a campus like this, I mean, I know there is a Catholic chaplain who is involved in trying to address taking care of the spiritual lives of the Catholics on campus. I'm not sure I have any insight as to how he can better kind of do this kind of work, but I guess they do have a few spaces where some of these issues, some of these conversations kind of take place. But I must say, I've been here only for a very limited time. I can't really go into the specific as to what can be done to. Let me speak to the.
Speaking of time, we're almost out. So.
Okay, sorry. Talking about the issue of slavery. Well, coming from Africa, I don't relate to slavery as an outsider, because even between African Americans and Africans, there's another level of conversation as to how to heal some of the relationship regarding slavery, because I've heard some African Americans, bring Africans to task on the issue of why did you do this to us? Why? Again, I think that reconciliation, it is very easy sometimes to just take the posture of a victim, but it is much more difficult to actually ask the question, was I part of the injuries? Of actually, what was my responsibility in any of these things which happen at that kind of scale? And people have been trying to, in Africa, we have been trying to kind of ask ourselves those questions. What was the responsibility, or what is the responsibility of Africa when it comes to issues of slavery? And we still have to address that question. Sorry.
Do you have a very quick response?
I really appreciate your question, because it aligns with the debate around how you understand injustice. So is it historical injustice, or is it enduring injustice? And my position on it is that it's an enduring injustice. It's not just historically based, understood, and brought to light. It has an intergenerational effect. That means that the injustice from the past has had a consequence and a hold on the present. And the hold that it has on the present is about the point that was made by my colleague: who benefited and who lost, or who was victimized and who was the perpetrator. And what it asks you to do is to understand that historical injustice has benefits that are not often understood with the same complexity as the victimization is understood. So that something like the sale of persons to bring an institution out of financial uncertainty isn't just a benefit that occurred historically to this institution. It had a consequence over time through the labor of those persons on behalf of other places and people. So why aren't those other people and places in dialogue with the institution to say, we own and acknowledge and recognize that we benefited. We took the labor from these people. We worked them in a particular way. We understand and recognize our implication and our sense of having to participate in your originary act of reparation, so that a financial reparation isn't just locally understood. If the financial relationship was the ground by which this event occurred, all the other parties have to be brought in and made to bear responsibility. And in that regard, the benefit and the consequences are not just held by one community, but are understood to be societal in implication. And I think that's really where pushing hard against that historical truth that you've brought to light and that you've acknowledged, pushing hard against it and saying, on what grounds can you continue to ignore this legacy, you, another institution that benefited? On what grounds can you continue to hold yourself to a moral center when you've, in fact, participated in this injustice? And that moral argument, I think, is incredibly powerful and incredibly important, because it exposes or brings to light the way that this act was not just one moment in time affecting one community of people, but had intergenerational consequences, as the very ceremony, the renaming and the honoring of descendants that you held on campus recognized. So where then are the people who benefited equally in the way that Georgetown has acknowledged itself as a beneficiary? Where are those people to also take part in and share that responsibility, that burden, that obligation, and that moral place that you've opened up and made possible for other people to partake, to recognize and participate in? So that would be my answer to the question of financial reparation, which is a really complicated question and carries so many different elements of stigma, but is absolutely necessary, because the benefit itself is the very ground on which you align those interests and you align those responsibilities.
Well, I need to bring this to a close. I am kind of throwing out some of the concluding remarks that I had thought I might make, but I think we've really heard an awful lot about the ripple effects and resonances of injustices, and had very thoughtful answers concerning that. I'm left with a sense of compounding and sometimes confounding questions. And this includes, how do we use our understanding of human rights, of UN definitions of human rights, to further our sensitivities to better locally grounded, case-based understandings and comparisons. So we've raised lots of issues, and I thank everyone for their participation, for the wonderful questions, and for the panelists especially. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.